Welcome back to the 1-0 podcast brought to you by Penn State Student Affairs. I'm Zach Allen,
I'm Joel Haas.
and we're back after a road trip to Columbus, Ohio. And this weekend, Penn State's moving on after, their loss against, a much worse Indiana team. But today, I don't think it would be fair if we just moved on and talked about Indiana solely. So we'll be recapping Ohio State a little bit before moving on to the Nittany Lions' upcoming game against the Hoosiers. But for now, first off, Joel, what'd you see against Ohio State from Penn State, and what exactly went wrong?
Yeah, I think what we saw on Saturday was pretty much a half team. It kind of looked like the offense just was not ready for the moment. I mean, the defense showed up for sure, held the Buckeyes in check for most of the game. We saw a really impressive performance, I thought, from them, and then the offense just kind of came out flat in the biggest game of the season to this point. 1 for 16 on third downs, and the one came in garbage time. If you even want to count that one, I mean, it wasn't quite an Iowa-esque performance, but it was still very much the defense dominating while the offense just couldn't get anything going.
Yeah, and coming into the game, Penn State's offense actually led the Big Ten in scoring. I mean, if that was the one game you watched at Penn State, you probably wouldn't have been able to tell that. And like you said, they were 1 for 16 on third down, which basically was 0 for 15 because the one conversion came in the final minute. Same with the one touchdown they scored. It came with like 20 seconds left in the game. So largely it was, like you said, a defensive performance where Ohio State's defense, without their top cornerback, really kind of shut down Penn State's offense. And, after the game, we obviously saw an emotional Drew Aller saying he sucked. You could just feel kind of the frustration in the room. And when we were talking to them, they kind of were already saying like, "Oh, we just got to move forward." Obviously, Penn State is known for their 1-0 mindset. That kind of allows them to do that, but you got to think this loss has to sting, considering it was their first real test on their schedule. Um, how can the Nittany Lions, sorry, kind of move on from this?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely difficult. I feel like it's a lot harder to move on from a loss than from a win. I mean, this was a big game. This was a lot of people were talking about it as, potentially the year that Penn State could get over the hump and take down Ohio State for the first time in 7 years and second time of Franklin's tenure. And they just weren't able to do that. I mean, it felt like the stars were kind of aligning where, they had this great team heading into the game. Ohio State looked to be weaker than it has been in years past. Ohio State, you already mentioned they were missing their top cornerback. They were missing some players on offense as well. I mean, running back, wide receiver, everything like that. So they were, a weakened version of themselves. So it just felt like Penn State's opportunity. And then when aren't able to get it done, um, they just struggled to really get the win. And I feel like that's just really hard to sort of just wipe from your mind now because, it felt like the whole beginning of the season was building up toward this game. All throughout the first 6 weeks where they were just winning, in dominant fashion every week, it just felt like it was building toward this game where they were saving everything. They weren't getting deep into the playbook. They were taking the starters out, shortly after halftime. And it was like they were just saving themselves for this game so that they would be able to go out and perform. And they just didn't do that, especially offensively.
Yeah, and I think another underrated aspect of that was Penn State's offensive rotation was not that extensive. It was kind of the same from start to finish. JB Nelson offensively, he was not listed on the availability report as out for the game or even questionable. He was ready to go. Obviously, on Wednesday, Franklin kind of said he was healthy enough to play, but they weren't really comfortable starting him. It was kind of just if someone got hurt. So we saw a lot of Vango Wane at left guard, and also during the game defensively. Even despite the great defensive performance that eventually got worn down as the game went on with Marvin Harrison and company, Chop Robinson and Amin Vanover, two of Penn State's top tier defensive linemen went down. And Franklin also said Vanover will be a game time decision. And, in regards to Chop Robinson, he said he hopes, he's back sooner than later. Don't exactly know what their injuries are. That's not, the Penn State way to disclose exact injuries unless they're season ending. But with that said, what do you think we'll see this week, kind of transitioning into Indiana, roster wise with those three injuries?
Yeah. The JB one was interesting to me because I think we had heard before the Ohio State game that Franklin said he expected both JB and Venga to get some time, and then it was just Venga the whole game, which I thought was interesting. Maybe something came up, that they weren't expecting, or I don't know, maybe they just liked what Venga gave them against the Buckeyes, something like that. I'm not really sure what the decision making was there, but that's a little bit worrying. And then you mentioned the other injuries to the defensive ends. I mean, those are, two key pieces right there that are going down on the defensive line. That's obviously not something that you want, especially Chop Robinson, who's, could be a top, 15, 20-ish pick in next year's draft. I mean, that's a huge piece going down right there. But we've heard from Franklin. He said that this season has been the deepest team that he can remember, since getting here. And, I mean, I guess we'll get to see that now. Now that these injuries are starting to pile up, that'll really be tested, and we'll find out.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the substitutions, it's Adisa Isaac, who's had a great season, and Denai Dennis Sutton. So it's not really like, oh, my God, they're diving into the scrubs. Those are still two really solid defensive linemen. I think, in reference to JB, he got carted off the sideline against Northwestern, so it might have just been, we don't really want to rush him back, maybe aggravate something. But moving on but before we move on to Indiana, here's a word from our sponsor. As Halloween approaches, remember that a costume is not an invitation or consent. It's fun to be creative with your costume, but remember to be aware of what is a fun outfit and what is considered to be someone's culture. Join student affairs in fostering an inclusive and welcoming campus culture, and let's celebrate responsibly and with respect. Spread the word and have a spooktacular Halloween. But yeah, the loss kind of forces, a bounce back game here for Penn State. They're massive favorites once again, like we saw the first 6 games of the season. But really, other than checking another win in the win column, this can serve as a bounce back game for Penn State, especially on the offensive side of the ball. I think all season it's kind of been, will they be explosive? And they have not been. They haven't showed that they can be, other than the first drive against West Virginia. So we'll see what happens again. I think it's kind of dipping into the territory where it's like they might not be able to be explosive. So I don't know your thoughts on that, but what can Penn State do at this point to kind of show that? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's really interesting because we've been talking about the explosive play thing all year, and it was where the explosive plays. And they were just getting it done with these short yardage gains, these short passes, these 4 or 5 yard runs. And Franklin kept saying, this is our identity. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're finding success, and we're just going to keep going back to that. But then against Ohio State, it's like that didn't work. So they clearly needed to add an extra element there of explosion when, the short yardage things just weren't working out, and they just weren't able to find that extra gear against Ohio State, which makes you wonder, is it there? Like, does it exist? And we saw from, Nick and Katron last year, they're obviously very explosive players, and that's just, it's really puzzling right now that, why they haven't been able to replicate that success that they saw in their freshman season. I mean, you would have thought they would not only match that, but even take a step forward now going into year 2. But they've really just regressed in every area, it seems like, which is really puzzling. I'm just not sure where the explosive plays are. And like you said, it's 7 games into the season. You're into the second half of the season now. So it's like, if we haven't seen it to this point, when are we going to see it, or are we going to see it at all? And that's kind of worrying. That's really problematic from the offense there. I don't know. I mean, the wheels aren't falling off. Like, they're 6-1. They can still, I mean, they'll be favored to go 10-2 the rest of the way. So they're still in position, to make a New Year's Six bowl game and stuff like that. But if they want to have a chance of beating Michigan, I think you have to find a way to get those explosive plays. And like you said, I mean, going against Indiana, one of the worst defenses in the country, I mean, that's a great opportunity to do that. But we've also said that about a lot of other teams before. We've said that, Delaware, it's a terrible defense that Penn State should be able to get explosive plays against. They couldn't do it. Same thing with UMass. They were a little bit better, but they really weren't that explosive against UMass either. And those were two teams that we thought we'd get to see that explosiveness against, and we didn't. And then, Indiana, it's another opportunity, but I don't know if there's anything there for them to show.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like the kind of general feeling is just losing hope. As you said, it kind of was their identity. And obviously, a first-year starting quarterback, I don't know if you can expect to work at the highest level you can, but still, it's been quite a drop-off. And, at least when I hear, like, explosive plays, I generally think of the passing game. But like you said, the running game also has not been there. Franklin on Wednesday, he kind of explained the passing game part, that it was still behind. It wasn't where he wanted it to be. He mentioned Trey Wallace's injury earlier in the season. And, some of the guys they've brought in have kind of developed slower to the system than they thought they would be. And going back to the running game point, obviously you lose Juice Scruggs and Landon Tangwell this season to medical retirement. But Hunter Norzad is not a bad offensive lineman at all. Neither is J.B. Nelson. J.B. was kind of last season one of the most exciting offensive line prospects that Penn State had coming up alongside Drew Shelton. So that's kind of been curious to me why it hasn't happened, especially since, we saw it on the first drive of the game against West Virginia, 72-yard touchdown pass to Keandre Lambert-Smith. But that just, it hasn't happened, and that identity was not there whatsoever against Ohio State. But, Indiana's a much worse opponent. They'll most likely get back on track. I think they're favored by over 30 points this week. But what can a win do for Penn State this week?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Tyler Warren said yesterday after practice, you don't want to let one loss become two, meaning, you don't want to let this Ohio State loss hang over. You don't want to come out slow and, demoralize and then lose another game, and then all of a sudden you're on this losing streak and the season starts falling apart. You obviously need a bounce-back game here, and I anticipate they will have one because they're just too talented, too deep, to be able to lose this game. I just don't see any way where Indiana wins this one. But, I mean, yeah, from a mental standpoint, I think it's really important just to be able to get back in that win column, just to really regain your identity that they had through the first 6 games and be able to say, this is who we are on offense. We're still an efficient offense. If especially on third downs, if they can sort of fix that, get rid of the issues that plagued them against Ohio State, which I do think was in part bad luck. Like, I think if Penn State plays Ohio State again, you're not going to see something like that on third down. That was kind of like I don't want to call it a fluky occurrence, but it was definitely uncharacteristically bad. And if they convert on more of those third downs, I think they find a lot more success, and maybe it's more competitive of a game. But it's just correcting those mistakes that you made against Ohio State, using it as a lesson, being able to not only get back to where you were those first 6 games, but to get even better now that you know what you have, what your weaknesses are, being able to evaluate those. Because when you're winning and you're winning by 30 points every week, it's like, you might have, some small weaknesses that you don't think are that big of a deal, but then all of a sudden when they cost you a game, it's like, whoa, we got to step back and evaluate, why did we lose, what went wrong, and then you really hone in on that, and, ideally you're able to fix that, but we'll see what they do this week.
Yeah, especially with, Michigan getting on the horizon here. I think last week was the first time the Collegian staff has been split on predictions. Kind of wasn't really even a thought the first 6 games. So I'm curious, Joel, we're going official predictions now. What's your prediction and why?
Yeah, I think I went with Penn State 42 and Indiana 3. I just don't see this one being close. We've seen, through the first 6 games, like you said, they weren't even close. It was just a huge win for Penn State. And I mean, they've proven that they can, beat up on these inferior teams. They can impose their will. And I think they'll just go right back to doing that this week. I considered giving Indiana the donut. I really thought about it because their offense is, I think in Big Ten play, they're averaging less than 10 points a game. They scored like 3 against Michigan and 7 against Ohio State, or I might have that backwards, something like that. But yeah, they've just really struggled offensively. I mean, they don't really have any impressive wins this year, sitting at 2-5, and the 2 wins I think are Indiana State, and I forget, it was like a MAC school they beat in overtime. So it's like, what's your best win? Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? I just don't see any way Indiana wins or even keeps this one close.
Yeah, I'm in agreement there. I had 44-6. I think, it's going to be on the defense again. They give the offense an opportunity, and like you said, Penn State has shown, they're able to go on these long, grueling, extended drives against these worst teams, and I think they'll get back to that. Obviously, they would have liked to do that last week, but it did not happen. So, this is a big bounce back game for Penn State. And we'll see what happens in the Nittany Lions return to Beaver Stadium. But yeah, I think that's all from us. Again, I'm Zach Allen.
I'm Joel Haas.
And this has been the 1-0 podcast. We'll see how Penn State does this weekend again. But you can follow us on Twitter at PSU Footblog and follow our coverage of Penn State football at psucollegian.com. Peace.